Latin American analyst Javier Farje, who joins us now live from London. Great to have you on, Javier. Tell us, how much more pressure will the fact that these protests are growing in Lima, how much pressure will they put on Dina Boluarte?
Well, the pressure is relentless. I mean, it hasn't stopped. I was checking the Peruvian media just before we went on air, and it's just relentless reports of people moving from the countryside, as you reported at the beginning of this piece, from Puno, mainly the southern part or Andean part of Peru, where the Aymara people, one of the indigenous communities in Peru, are very angry because many civilians have died as a result of these protests. Now, Mr. Castillo has become an irrelevant now. It is no longer about Mr. Castillo anymore, Maria. It is basically about closing down Congress and calling for early elections. Now, Congress decided to call for early elections for early 2024. That has not satisfied the Peruvian people or the protesters. They want to have early elections by the end of this year, which was the initial proposal that President Boluarte
Javier, let me just jump in. How likely is that to have those elections immediately, as they're calling for, or this year? Because what Dina Boluarte is proposing is next year. Too far away.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's up to Congress now. Congress is the only institution that can decide to call for early elections in December 2023, which was the proposal that Dina Boluarte made. Congress has been reluctant to do that. They don't want to do that. They believe that the logistics, would be very difficult to achieve that, although other parties within Congress say, look, if we don't call for elections now, this is going to get much worse than it is now. It is pretty bad already. Now, for tomorrow, the biggest confederation of trade unions in Peru have called for a strike for tomorrow, and the arrival of communities from the countryside to Lima, some of them have already arrived, is going to make things even more complicated, because until now, Lima was more or less in favor of Boluarte's decisions, because there's been a big split between Lima, the elite Lima, and the countryside. Now Lima has become the focus of the protests, but the people coming from the countryside. So it's going to be very difficult for the president not to try to convince Congress to call for early elections now.
Okay, and President Boluarte, she actually said that she would hold talks with the protesters when they arrive in Lima. Is that just a figure of speech, just words, or is she serious? And how would that actually happen?
I think she's serious. I think she really wants to do that. In December, mid-December, she gave a speech when she called, before this protest, he called for a dialogue. She even used the Quechua, the indigenous language, to call to the indigenous peoples from the countryside, from the Andean region. But it hasn't worked because the repression has been brutal. 47 people, as you mentioned at the beginning of this report, have died. And many communities want not only closing down parliament and not only elections, but they want justice for those who died as a result of police brutality, which is what many organizations have said. Now, the Institute of Peruvian Studies, the biggest, most important and more respected think tank in Peru, have concluded that the only way this could actually they could find a solution is to have a dialogue, but a dialogue which will include justice for those people who actually died. So it's no longer a social issue. It's basically the emergency, the urgency of trying to find way to satisfy the protesters. So far, nothing has worked.
And there is a state of emergency at the moment, and yet those protests continue. What is the role of the military right now? And does Dina Boluarte still have the support of the military, and for how long could that last?
The army is well behind the government. The army rejected Mr. Castillo's attempts to close Congress in September and December last year, but they were very, very quick in rejecting that, and they supported Mrs. Boluarte's appointment as interim president. So the army is very much behind the government. Not only that, many people believe that the army is not only behind the government, but complicit in some of the abuses that have been committed against the protesters. So the army is very well behind the government. She doesn't have to worry about losing support from the army. And also, and one of the problems that she has at the moment is that many people believe that she's trying to politicize the army and the police by peace marches where the police would take part. She had to cancel that because that created an even more dangerous situation than it was before. So the army is well behind the president. She's in no danger of losing power in that respect. And it remains to be seen whether the protesters are prepared to accept the invitation for a dialogue. So far, nothing has worked, and the situation is getting worse and worse as we speak.
Javier Farje, fantastic to have you on. Great analysis, as always, a Latin American analyst from London live. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Maria. It's a pleasure.